Hello, Will.
Hello, David.
And hello, Rachel and Jeff.
Hello.
And hello, YouTube. And welcome back to live chat, our fourth live chat of this little mini series we've been doing. Our last one for now.
Yes.
But to celebrate the last of them, we're having a double feature. So we have two guests today instead of just one, which has been what we've normally been doing. For anyone just joining us, this is a series where we invite guests for a Q&A about topics we've discussed on the podcast before. Today we are talking about conservation paleontology, which is a field of where you're using fossil information to help inform conservation of living species.
Yes.
This actually, way back in episode 8, our first listener-requested episode.
It was.
Yeah, so it's a historic little moment.
It was one of the first topics we got requested to do that we both went, oh.
And then we did it. So, without further rambling from me, Rachel and Jeff, if you would please introduce yourselves, what you do, and what is your relation to this field of study?
I'll go first.
Sure, I'll go first.
You go first.
So I'm an integrative conservation scientist. And what that means is I just use many different disciplines to help inform my issue that I'm concerned with. And that's, for me, to put bison back into their native prairie. So a lot of restoration of bison. I have my bachelor's from ETSU, East Tennessee State University, in geology, master's in geosciences and paleontology, and I just received my doctorate at Texas A&M in wildlife sciences. And so, yeah. Yeah, thank you.
All right, I'll go next. So I'm Rachel, and I just got my doctorate at Texas A&M too. I'm a conservation paleobiologist. Thank you. And I did a bachelor's in biology, and then master's in paleontology at ETSU, and a master's in teaching. So my work is also interdisciplinary. I use lots of different parts I've learned along the way. And whereas Jeff studies one species, bison, I study communities of hoofed mammals and how species coexist on the landscape and the relationship that their bones have with the environment so that we can study them through time using fossils.
Cool. Excellent. Fascinating. Yep. It's just such a cool topic of discussion. So the way that this will work is we have a list of questions that we've collected from our listeners, our followers on the internets. And anyone who is here in the chat can feel free to chime in, throw a question in the YouTube chat, and let us know. If you are not in the YouTube chat, but you're watching somewhere out there on the internet, send us, you can give it a shot on Facebook and Twitter, and I'll be switching over to them occasionally, and hopefully I'll notice it. Also, I should mention, just a little plug, we got new shirts.
Yeah.
So for our listeners, these are the new designs for our merch. And that's the only hour. We're very excited about it. Really cool. So I'd like to start off with a question.
Can we get this on your website? Actually,
yeah, you can get these on our Zazzle store.
All right, perfect.
So the link is in the description of every podcast episode, and you can also find it on the blog. So I want to start off with a question. You mentioned, Rachel, that Jeff is studying conservation issues related to a single species, whereas you're working on communities. So ecosystem minded more. How do those two approaches differ?
So our work is fairly similar. We have the same end goal, I suppose, but he's focused more on how, well, you can correct me if I'm wrong, how the animal is able to live in this environment metabolically and physiologically, and more specifically about that species. Whereas I look at their skeletal elements and kind of group species based on the environment that occurs there. So given, say, precipitation, these are the makeup of ankle bones that could live in this area. But so it's on a different scale for the animals.
It's kind of like ground level and more wider view.
Yeah. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so. That's perfect.
Yeah. His research is also limited in North America because that's where bison occurs. So he's able to work at smaller spatial scales. I work globally with artiodactyls, so even-toed split-hoofed mammals. They occur on most everywhere. They're very widespread. I'm working at a larger spatial scale. My communities are not as close together as his bison ranches might be.
Okay.
For any of the Eurasians listening, I'm game to work on European bison.
Yes, you will find his Twitter contact below his name.
So, one more quick question, and then I'll start getting into these lists. I would assume, based on especially Jeff's talking about bison, and we're talking about conservation, that most of your fossil work is more recent geological things.
Yeah, I definitely stay in the subfossil, barely fossil category. And by that, I mean, when I'm excavating these bones, they still have quite a bit of collagen left in them. And that makes it really easy to do radiocarbon dating. So within 40,000 years, I can have a really good contextual basis for when these animals lived. It's pretty high resolution compared to what you start looking at for mosasaurs or going back even further into trilobites. You really have that huge difference of geologic age. But yeah, that makes, specifically for my work, bison really, really useful is probably the best way to put it. It's also that bison were cosmopolitan in North America. They were from Alaska all the way down to Nicaragua, from New York all the way to California. They were ranging everywhere, and we have tens of thousands of bison fossils throughout Canada, US, and Mexico. So it's a great species to work with.
And my fossil suites are of similar age now. So I've done some work with like late Pleistocene, glacial, interglacial type sites, as well as historical records based in the last 100 years. And you guys know that my work on the rhinos was much older, and so my goal is to push this kind of work further back in time, but it's still fairly new, and using the more recent fossils gives us a lot better resolution and allows us to establish these kind of trait relationships and patterns that we can then use further back when it becomes more sparse.
Right.
That's really cool.
For our people who have been following the series, last episode we had our friend Laura on, and we talked a bunch about research she did with rhinos at Gray. Well, Rachel was the lead author on that, based on your... I remember when you were working on it as your thesis way back in the day.
I started that a long time ago.
So we've got questions are pouring in on the chat, so I'm going to start asking some people. Yeah, we've got like 3 rapid fire. Let's start getting some of our pre-submitted questions. This one is from Lucas on Facebook, our bud Lucas, who asks, do paleontologists connect with lobbying groups in the United States or elsewhere to assist in conservation efforts?
So thank you, Lucas, for that question.
Yes.
I'll have Jeff answer it. He's been doing a lot of policy work with his research lately, so you can answer this one.
Thanks for that, Rachel.
Back to you, Jeff.
So yes, I do work a little bit more with policy. As we just talked about, bison is subfossil into archaeological history, into historical, and into today. And the program I work with is the Boone and Crockett Club and the Dr. James Red Duke Wildlife Conservation and Policy Program at Texas A&M. And so what we do is we strive to take our actionable science and make it usable for policymakers, decision makers. And so a lot of what I do is creating work that helps inform how best to create sanctuaries, wildlife refuges, expand national parks if we can, or better inform how management should be done on them. We'll get to that in a little bit later. For how paleontologists work with public policy, right now the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology is working right now on trying to reverse some of the recent decisions on Bears Ears National Monument. And really that's trying to strive to protect this resource that's once in a lifetime for us, really. It's the only chance we're going to get to know what it used to live in these strata. And so that's one that first comes to mind. I think conservation paleo, especially with the bleeding the subfossil into historic, is going to lend itself to have a lot more of these connections moving forward.
And then jumping off of that, sort of speaking of working with modern conservationists, Jesse on Facebook asks, or suggests, is there a positive success story that you could share?
So Lynn's comes to mind.
Yep.
So a USGS researcher, Lynn Wingard, she came to give a seminar talk in our department 2 years ago, maybe. She's done work in the greater Everglades region, and they've done this multi-proxy study using pollen and invertebrates and I think some
mollusks,
benthic organisms, but they're measuring haline levels over time, so the salt levels, and they can track sea level rise through time. And they've used that to implement restoration efforts in the Everglades, and their focus is on hydrology and helping preserve, the mangrove swamps and some of the more solid inland parts of the Everglades from sea level rise. So that's one that I tend to bring up in a lot of my work because I really like that the multi-proxy and like actionable work that they did there. And I think they worked over maybe 5,000 years, so not incredibly deep time, but enough time to see the changes happening.
And I will say my master's thesis actually led to quite a bit of a big impact. So I was looking at what is the native status of bison in the Colorado Plateau region, as the Four Corners. Specifically focusing in on Grand Canyon National Park and the surrounding area, Kaibab National Forest, right next to it. And so what I was setting out to do is document where do we find bison in the subfossil, in the archaeological record, in the historical record, in rock paintings, all of these different resources of when are bison here. And what I found was that bison actually are native recently in that area, but not in huge populations like they were in Great Plains. But what that led to was, from the publication that came out of my thesis, led to a now interagency agreement between the state of Arizona and the National Park Service and the Forest Service to all work together on creating a management plan to keep bison there. They already have bison on the North Rim, but there were some other issues trying to figure out, are these native? If they're not native, the NPS cannot keep bison management on their property. But if they're native, then they have that narrative to stay on it and make it ecologically sound.
That's so cool.
And that's what's happening.
That's incredible.
Well, and I like that because that's a question that I don't think a lot of people would realize you'd need to ask is, are the animals that are here now where they're supposed to be, or historically supposed to be?
Right. And how would you know that outside? That's it is a sentence that I've said before, and I've loved it ever since I heard somebody else smart say it, that paleontology is a field of study that uniquely gets to explore ecosystems untouched by humans.
Yeah.
You get that sense of what it was like before.
That's right.
Yes.
And speaking of some modern conservation stories, we have a question in the YouTube chat from I'm gonna say Bohan or Bojan. Tell me if I'm wrong on pronouncing this name. Who is asking about Yellowstone? I don't know if the two of you know much about Yellowstone, but this question is interested in the story, the impact of wolves, and how scientists study that sort of rebound and impact story.
No more.
I do. I know more. Okay, so we'll talk our way through this. So yeah, the wolves were brought back. I forget how many years ago now. 20
in the 90s
or so. And they documented these cascading effects in the park. So the elk population changed and the rivers changed, and it was attributed to the wolves, and they've since kind of backed off of that, I think.
A little bit.
The strength of the impact that the wolves had. But there were definitely some changes that were happening there. So I don't have much knowledge of the Yellowstone case specifically, but something that I try to tackle, or I'm going to try to tackle in my work, is considering these national parks that have these static or these like fixed boundaries. They're not necessarily allowing for species shifts through their parks. So when we have these species, these elk and these wolves and everybody happy in Yellowstone, as the environment and climate shifts, those species may not be as suited to live there as something from somewhere else. And so allowing species to move through these parks, as like the bison, may not be native, but it might be if the climate changes in a certain way and the habitat changes. And so trying to explore the flexibility of these park boundaries is something that I think we're going to do more of as we get a better understanding of species responses.
That's where this framework of interagency management plans now come into play, because all around Yellowstone National Park are more federal lands with BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, the U.S. Forest Service, other national parks, Grand Tetons are close by, and they can all work together on this.
Excellent.
As well as all the private lands nearby, too.
Yeah.
We have a couple of questions regarding fossils, so the use of fossils in this regard. We had a question from Mark on Facebook who's asking about how you account for preservation bias when it comes to conservation questions. And we have a question here from Jayshree, and again, let me know if I've said that wrong, I apologize, who's asking about how you are impacted where in the opportunities where you get to study complete fossils, body fossils versus incomplete remains or trace fossils, as they've mentioned.
Can I take the bias first?
Sure.
So the preservation bias question I'll take first. We'll go back to the Lynn Wingard's study with the USGS in the Everglades. One of the multi-proxy sets, one set was pollen. And in pollen, there are certain species that are just prolific in how much pollen they generate and disperse. So grasses have a bunch, and pines have what are called air bladders on their pollen sacs. So they actually fly a long distance. Whereas things like Suga, hemlock, has a really huge, well, still can't see with the naked eye, but relatively huge pollen. And it goes about as far as I can throw this table. It doesn't go very far, and it doesn't produce very much. So you have to make these corrections based on what we know of plants today and correct for that overrepresentation or underrepresentation.
Interesting.
And in the work that I do at the community level, I use occurrence records rather than abundance records. So I'm looking at who is there, like it's a yes or no, as opposed to how many are there. And so that helps with some of that too. And some work is just starting to get going. Some papers have come out recently trying to figure out how we can calculate abundance based on what's there and how it affects the measures that we're doing. But right now it's pretty much occurrence data because, yeah, that can be a problem.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah.
And then the second part was, sorry, I'm trying to remember the second part of the question.
The question, so the way that this was phrased, I think was referring to something we were talking about before, and I don't remember what we said. But the question is, so is it the difference between working with whole body fossils as opposed to trace fossils? Do you have experiences you can speak to about working with fossils at different levels of preservation?
Yeah, so there's, in say, western South Dakota, western Nebraska, the White River group, they have a lot of, rivers that were going through the area that were paleo rivers. And out there, yeah, you get a lot of the body skeletons and other bones preserved, but you get a lot of these trace fossils that help represent, I wouldn't say quite behaviors, but at least some sort of tracking. You can see where you have all of these, what seem to be prey species herding together, walking along the shoreline of this bank of the river. And then you can see these zigzagging behind them in telodont tracks as they're just trying to follow the herd. And so you can learn different things based on what that particular fossil is, whether it's trace or if it's whole body. But you are restricted.
And in our work now, I do some work with teeth measurements, which are typically isolated teeth that we find, but sometimes you get them in the skulls. And we've both used ankle bones, which are typically preserved. If skeleton elements are going to be preserved, you're likely to get a calcaneum, the heel bone, because it's so dense and there's not much meat. Scavengers don't want to carry it off. So you tend to find those. But we don't, well, I don't anyway, work so much with whole skeletons anymore. I worked on rhinos skeletons for a while.
Yeah, you were spoiled.
Skeleton.
Yeah, right? As much of a skeleton as you could possibly want.
I know.
That's
so. I think there was also a question, if I can just like jump on that question and follow up. I think there was one that was asked about areas of preservation.
Yes,
And
I was going to ask that. I can actually, I'll read that out because I was going to ask
okay.
that.
Yeah, I think.
Next.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't mean to take your job.
Oh, no, that's fine. I'll read it so that our questioner gets credit for it and people will know.
Yes. Yes.
This was a question by Michael on Facebook, who asks about places where fossilization is less common. Rainforests, upland ecosystems where you don't get as many fossils, but human impact is important as it can be extreme. Is there any way to judge the pre-human state of those ecosystems? Is that harder? Michael actually specifically says, is there any way to judge what the ecosystem should look like?
Right. So it gets complicated up there. Like I'm thinking rainforest areas, like you mentioned. One thing that we do is we try to find fossil sites of an analogous deposition. So obviously, if it's hard to fossilize now, it's hard to fossilize back then too in a rainforest, which makes using these multi-proxy studies really useful. So you may not get mammal fossils preserved there, but you might get pollen, or you might get leaves, or you might get some kind of herps preserved.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's important to have these models that work for lots of different groups of plants and animals, because you're not sure what you're going to find in certain environments. And so my model on artiodactyls may not work as well in rainforest because they're just not preserved there, but someone else's leaf model might work. And so we just try to use as many things as we can to tackle the problems.
And I want to circle.
Yes.
And I want to circle back to the operative word, should.
Oh, yeah.
Should ecosystems look like? They should look like ecosystems. They're always shifting. They're always changing. Species come in and out. That's the natural way of things. So trying to have a set point in say, conventional restoration ecology, having a set point that you're trying to get back to, may not always be the best case to approach. It may be that you want to understand the processes. If your river flow should be higher, but you don't have any outwash anymore, either something's happened to the ground in front upstream, or there's something happening along the riverbanks, and you need to really look into those processes instead of looking at who was here and why. What processes led to them being there?
Yeah.
Right. No, it makes sense, because like even if you reintroduce the specific species, if there's something wrong with the way the habitat's functioning, they're just gonna die again.
Right. They're gone for a reason.
So in my work, I'm looking at the traits rather than the specific species that occur there, and so I'm interested in the trait composition, and you might be able to equal that trait composition with any number of combinations of species. It might not need to be what was there 100 years ago. And so it's not that we're looking for what it should look like based on what it used to. It's what it could look like based on how it might change.
Right. I like that. I guess to Jeff's point, the status quo in nature is that there isn't a status quo. It's that things are malleable.
The only thing that doesn't change is change itself.
Right, yeah.
You can tell we just defended our dissertation, so we're probably should.
I think it's an important
It
point.
It is.
No, it's great. And actually, it leads nicely into, we have a handful of questions about restoration and reintroduction. A couple things. Boyan, thank you for telling me how to pronounce your name. I appreciate it. And we're getting into reintroduction and rewilding. And I just want to say, even though it has gone well down the list here, I saw Felix's question and we're getting there.
Yes.
So I didn't forget it. It's going to happen. But let's start with this question from David on Twitter, who says, getting at that point that you mentioned, ecosystems keep changing even after you lost species. David asked, what would you say is the most objective way to measure when an ecosystem has evolved beyond its lost species?
I like that.
So I think I'm going to take the easy way out because I don't study species. So in what I'm looking at how the traits are changing through time. And so at a certain spot, as the ecosystem is evolving, the trait composition that it can sustain is changing. And what that means for the species who live there is that they might go extinct, they might shift their range, they might go through any of these number of processes. But it's part of this continuous process. And so part of what I want to go into next is exploring how we document those processes in the fossil record, so that we can understand things like that. Like, what does it mean if you pass this point, and what got you to that point and past it? And yeah, that's how I would approach it.
Yeah. And so I'm going to go to the systems approach of it also and say that not every species is going to respond to rising temperature or increasing drought in the same way. Their climatic envelope in which they can operate and survive is different based on species. So, for example, the shortgrass prairie, who have prairie dogs, bison, pronghorn antelope, black-tailed mule deer living together, they're not all going to respond the same way with increasing temperature and drought. Bison might have to move north. Prairie dogs might have to move east. They may go away from each other.
Yeah.
We don't right now. That's where the science is leading right now, is where are these species supposed to be? And that's now developing into a sub discipline of anticipatory management and conservation. How do you get these species to the leading edge of that climate envelope, rather than on the lagging edge where you're going to wink out and go extinct? How do we help either translocate them or assist their transportation to where they need to be?
So this idea, contributing idea is called climate connectivity. And so giving these animals the potential to shift, making sure there's enough connected land that they can live on, that they can shift their distributions accordingly. And right now the U.S. is not so great at it.
It's not surprising.
But it's also a new idea, and this idea of conservation paleontology is only not very old. I can't estimate, but within 15 or 20 years, we've really amped up the work here. So it's all fairly new.
Yeah. Well, we've got wonderful up-and-coming scientists like yourselves working on it.
Entire career's worth of work.
So, when we talk about conservation paleontology and reintroductions, I think that it is these days inevitable that this question of Pleistocene rewilding comes up. And we've talked about this on the podcast. So, for people who are unfamiliar, this is a question from Twitter from Little Grayfish, who is referencing this idea that where we've had species go extinct, we can look at the fossil record and find animals or species today that do the same sort of thing that the extinct ones did and put them in an ecosystem. So, for example, North America used to have the American lion and the American cheetah, and we used to have elephants, and could we introduce modern representatives to do those things? The question is, do you think it's a good idea to introduce functionally equivalent species to ecosystems where they've gone extinct in the last hundreds or thousands of years, like the Pleistocene Park idea, which we've discussed?
Yep.
Or, there's drama at the end of this question.
Ooh.
Or do you think it would do more harm than good?
Jeff called dibs on this question already.
I'm just going to start with a comment saying that we're already doing it. Bison almost went extinct in the last ice age. We almost hunted them to extinction, and we've replaced them with cattle, to a huge economic benefit to our entire society. So that's one direction. Now we're trying to reverse some of that action back to bison. Yes, cattle were not native, but they are loosely equivalent. Very, very loosely. They are a grazer.
If you squint, they're very similar.
Yeah, right? If I take my glasses off.
That's right. So that's where I'd start it.
Yeah, and I would say I will never advocate for putting proboscideans or elephants of any sort out on the prairie here. There's just too many things to consider, and I don't think that extreme is needed. There's some amount of this that occurs naturally. So like peccaries are continuing to shift north. Armadillos are shifting north. My family told me recently armadillos are into southern Illinois now, which is fascinating. Yeah, so these species are already shifting and kind of creating their own new communities. By purposefully introducing something, you run a lot of risks that could go wrong. And so while I think there's merit to exploring it, and this is written into a proposal I have pending right now, is to look at how domestic species that have become straight, like feral, or have escaped their livestock pens, how they're affecting the trait composition on the landscape. Are they replacing a native species? Because in West Texas, a lot of species that were brought here for trophy hunting, like nilgai and red sheep and I forget who else is out there. Yeah. But they've escaped from these trophy hunting ranches, and they're just all over the landscape, and they look like they belong there, and they do really well. Yeah, oryx. And so the consequences could be limited resources for pronghorn then, or bighorn sheep. Like there's got to be some kind of give and take there, and so we need to understand what the impact is before we start just putting an elephant out there.
Think of the zebra mussel and the Asian flying carp and the ecological devastation that came with that introduction, intentional or not. It happened.
And I do think with intention we can try to minimize impacts, but we're never perfect at it.
Well, yeah, no animal's a closed system. Like,
right.
They're gonna bring in weird stuff.
You have to consider the animals that do live there, because this might be a new predator, or it might be something about competing. And there's just
the butterfly effect.
Yes, exactly.
So I think it's worth exploring, like research-wise, using the computer. Maybe we don't do it immediately. I think using some of these systems that are already happening to understand the possible outcome.
Yeah.
Is where we are right now.
Try and guide that outcome as best as possible. Yeah. Well-informed public policy.
Mm-hmm.
Right. It sounds like that's a big part of it. As dramatic as it is to think of the doing the thing and, cargo shipping a bunch of elephants over here to the U.S., along with the predators that have to hunt them.
Yep.
Yeah.
We don't have to do that. They're already here in the zoos.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a fair point. We just need to open the gates.
I will say that's a question that came up in my prelim exams and my dissertation defense. Yep. So it's something that
it's an active
follows
debate.
My research.
Well, along those lines, if I may take it yet a step further onto the subject of de-extinction, which we've talked about before.
Yes.
Which I know isn't necessarily what you all are working on. One of our younger listeners, Felix, asks, if we brought back mammoths, what problems would there be? It's a good question.
Yeah.
That's a good question.
So I just submitted a paper that's human-oriented, so I'm thinking humans right now. And the biggest issue for to release them, say, into the Canadian and Alaskan steppes is that there's people that live there. And these are novel ecosystems to elephants. Because remember, when mammoths were here, all of Canada was an ice sheet, 2 miles thick. So those ecosystems are brand new to elephants in North America, if we were to introduce them today. And people live there too. So those people don't have any knowledge of how to interact with these things. So this human-wildlife conflict would just skyrocket.
And we have friends who study human-elephant conflict in Africa. And so this is still something that people are trying to figure out, how to coexist with elephants. And I think that would definitely be a major thing over here. They are notorious for tearing up crops and destroying fences and sometimes houses. And it's just, and then, humans have to live their lives too. And yeah.
Would it be cool to see?
Sure.
Yes.
Yeah, I guess you have to think real carefully before introducing a herd of 10-ton animals into a new
Yeah,
place.
and you
Big
have to
You
smart.
can't
consider
just do one. You have to do a whole herd.
Yeah.
you have to have a herd, and you would have to have enough food to feed them. So do we even have the right vegetation to feed them? And do we have enough of it? No. Do they have water access wherever we drop them off? There's just a lot of things to consider.
And Eastern Russia is trying to experiment with this now. They've
Yeah.
brought in huge herds of bison to repopulate the areas and horses to replace the Przewalski's horse. There's just not enough of them to repopulate.
Mhm.
So places are trying it in remote areas.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It also makes me wonder what you were saying about there being competition. Like Canada already has a megafauna herbivore in the moose. Like,
Mhm.
Yeah,
now are we going to have to worry about the moose if we were to bring back mammoth?
yeah, and,
Right.
and bison and elk and muskox and reindeer.
Caribou,
Yeah.
yeah.
So
Lots of things to consider.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
It's not a simple thing.
no. Jeff, you were talking about bison before and the reintroduction, and we actually did get a question about this from Arik, and again, let me know if that's not how you say your name, who has said in the YouTube chat here live, hey, you can put questions in the YouTube chat, everybody. I've heard of bison-cow hybrids in an effort to preserve bison and domesticate to produce an economically valuable product. First of all, how do you view this as being a viable way to preserve the species? And second, how could this domestic bison affect its native habitat?
That's a good question, and it's one that does keep popping up everywhere I go. And so, yeah, the original thinking of hybridizing cattle and bison was to create a hardy, ecologically hardy species that can resist drought and poor conditions and still at least be viable on the landscape. That thinking, though, was from the 1800s. This is a really old school of thought, and it has not panned out well. You get the worst traits of both species. So they're really stubborn, and they're not that productive. And so what we see today with the testing that's been going around is to try and weed some of that out. Is we only see about 5% of the entire bison population has any remnant of this still in their pool.
Can you explain the testing, what they're looking for?
So there's certain markers, genetic markers, on the mitochondrial DNA that you can pull up. And they'll say, hey, this looks like bison, and this one looks like cattle. And then if you get a mix of the two, then you say, oh, well, this is actually a hybrid, because we see both appearing. And so at the genetic level, we can figure out what that admixture was. So for bison producers today, who are private bison producers today in North America, who are part of the National Bison Association, it is illegal to crossbreed these species.
Interesting.
You cannot do that to be a member. There is the American Beefalo Association, who continues to perpetuate this lineage to try and make it more viable than the poorer traits of both. And really, at this point, I would say it's a novelty item. It's not going to be replacing bison or cattle at this point.
I will say, I've only been around the bison industry as long as we've been together, so 10 years. And I would have never known there were cattle genetics in that bison. Like, it looks like a bison, it talks like a bison,
Yeah.
It is a bison. There's not that much left to make it look like a cattle. But yeah, there's still some of that genetic material left in there.
Interesting. The person that I called Arik says that their name is pronounced Eric, so thanks, Eric. Here is another question from Michael on Facebook. Speaking about introduced, the question of introduced species causing problems, have any old world species that were introduced to the Americas started to develop into new subspecies, and if so, would removing that new diversity be controversial?
That is a heavy question. So I was thinking of the hogs.
Oh, yeah.
So the first thing that comes to my mind is the pigs. So we have the peccaries natively here. That's the North American version of the pig. But what we think of as a pig was brought here as a livestock animal and got out, turned loose, somehow ended up wild. And it has turned into...
For 500 years.
For 500 years, yeah. Thank you. And has turned into this feral boar hog. And I don't know how different it is from what came over, but it has a huge ecological impact across the South, especially. And I believe they're like all over.
They're now
the most part.
being reported in Saskatchewan.
Yeah, but in
wow.
So yeah.
Cool.
So
wow. Okay.
And they are just little terrors, and not little, they're huge terrors in Texas. They kill people, they tear up landscapes, they cause car accidents, and there are, as far as I know, no rules about how you hunt them, because they just want them gone. They're prolific, they're everywhere.
Open season.
They make lots of more hogs. And so removing that genetic diversity, I don't think would be so controversial. It's how you remove it that becomes controversial. How do you limit their populations in a humane and controlling way that isn't, harmful to the hogs or hurting them unnecessarily? But yeah, I think most people would say, get rid of them. and you said horses.
Yeah.
Right?
So I was going to do one last little cap on that. It's like, they are ecologically successful.
Yeah.
All these died out a long time ago.
Well. Yeah.
So maybe they are useful for trying to redomesticate if we can.
Mm-hmm.
But then you have to ask questions about if they're taking the place of peccaries.
Right.
So it just keeps going.
And so, horses originated in North America and then were extirpated in North American continent and were brought back by the conquistadors and then many other successions after that. And so we have now the Mustang and the American quarter horse, who are genetically different from their predecessors from the old world. I don't see many people wanting to get rid of American quarter horses or Mustangs, although they are wreaking ecological damage in states like Nevada and Arizona. And so the management is really what's the controversial part, is how you take care of it.
So he does more work on this than I do. But the human factor plays a large role here, right? So if you're asking people, do you want to get rid of these feral hogs or do you want to get rid of these feral horses, or both, they have a lot stronger feelings depending on the animal that you're limiting. Right. People are more attached to horses than they are to pigs.
They are culturally significant to us humans.
Yeah. So those are like the two examples that come to mind.
Yeah.
I remember reading about issues because there are people here in the U.S. and around the world who are invested in removing introduced species, dangerous introduced species. And I've heard of a handful of cases where you have introduced species that have been around for so long that they've become culturally important.
Yeah,
that
iconic.
People go, oh no, that's... I think I heard about this with swans.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
I think it was New York or somewhere in that area, where people were going, no, those have been here for like 100 years. We've grown up with this species.
Those are our swans.
Those are our swans, or whatever it was. And so there's no buy-in from people. And in fact, there's opposition to removing
No, I think there's motions to protect the swan. Right. Put in official protection.
Yeah, I know a good number of birds were brought over to make Central Park look like a traditional English garden. And so I think there are a number of species that...
Starlings come to mind.
Starlings, yeah.
The European starling.
Yes. So we have a question here from Creatures of the Labyrinth.
Cool name.
In our YouTube chat. So a minotaur, I assume.
Yep.
Who's asking, we mentioned that ecosystems tend towards consistent change. We said before that ecosystems are kind of ever-shifting, but agriculture is based on trying to keep things simple and predictable. So they ask, do you think that an agricultural society can coexist with a healthy ecosystem, or are these oxymorons in some way?
Oh, it's like my grant proposal.
If you're a funder,
Yeah.
let us know.
So recently there have been papers that recognize agricultural land as part of the ecosystem scale because it covers such a large amount of land. It's so prolific and it's such a large role. Like it's just its own ecosystem now. That being said, it's a lot easier for some species to live in agricultural land than it is for others. So I have a lab mate who studies snakes, and I'm vaguely remembering, I might be wrong. I hope John is listening and can correct me. But he had a paper that came out, he wasn't an author, he was reading this paper, that snakes were actually beneficial to some types of agriculture lands because of the way they move the soil or something. But the animals that I study might be eating the crops that are growing there. And so they're not quite as welcome. I know when we were in Tennessee, bears would eat corn a lot and pay the price. And so I forget where I was going with this. So when you're thinking about conservation on agriculture lands, you have to consider like what animal it is and the impact it has on agriculture, because that's still, like, you have to balance the economic and the ecological, right? And so I think working with the agricultural managers, the farmers, to help with these corridor issues. If you have protected land on either side of your field, just give them a corridor. Like, let's help connect these and try to keep the animals, in their piece of land, and the corn in their piece of land. And it's just, we don't know yet. I think it's possible. I think we have a long ways to go before it's actually viable.
Yeah, and so I think that is largely also having to do with crop agriculture. I'd say that livestock agriculture is a little bit better at mixing the ecosystems with the way that they manage, because they're highly dependent on pastures, which are grasslands. And so your same grassland species are going through. But with crops, corn, soybean, cotton, etc., there's quite a few papers that have been coming out over the last decade looking at planting swatches in the middle of your cornfield that are wildflowers, and just leave them as perennial wildflower swatches. And don't harvest it, don't cut it with the combine, please. Leave them. And that creates these corridors. It creates these places for native bees to be able to pollinate and to be able to move out and have more than just corn pollen accessible to them. And that research has been done by Jonathan Foley, a global eco guy on Twitter. You should follow him. He's got a lot of cool things. I like his work, but that's one of the things that comes to mind. And he's shown with quantitative analysis, by including these swatches of wildflowers, is you actually have increased productivity of your wanted crops. Not just per acre, but net.
Wow.
Yeah, so even though you take it out of production, you're increasing all of production.
Huh. Very interesting. So
done.
not only not necessarily mutually exclusive, the stability of agriculture versus the law versus chaos of agriculture versus nature, but possibly
together,
beneficial.
They must.
Yeah.
Cool. Wow, what a pitch.
Hopeful.
Yeah, hey, how about that? Well, I'm gonna let me ask a depressing question.
Hi.
This is also, our Minotaur friend says that their name is Lewis. Thanks, Lewis.
Good name for a Minotaur.
Yeah, I think so. Here's another question in the chat. Austin asks, are there instances in which a keystone species or other essential species has gone extinct, and how do you deal with such situations? And if you wouldn't mind to explain what a keystone species is for anyone who's unfamiliar with the term.
Sure.
Do you want to go first? You
Sure.
study a keystone species.
I do study a keystone species. So a keystone species is one that is essentially an ecosystem engineer, where its behavior and its interactions with the ecosystem around it will create more ecosystems for other animals. And so one example with bison is that they wallow. They have a behavior where they will roll on their sides. They'll dig into the dirt. They make this pit. It's almost a permanent pit. It will sustain on the landscape for decades. In the springtime, it will be inundated with rainwater. It creates a little pond. You now have a place for your frogs to reproduce in the prairies where there's very little water at times. And so it's essential for a cascading effect for other species to sustain. Beavers are another ecosystem engineer in Keystone Species. The way that they will manipulate, yes, crocodiles too. Also the ecosystem engineers. And so they all manipulate the ecosystems around them. And so we did almost lose bison. And in many places we did lose them. And bringing them back has reinstated some of these natural norms. Anurans populations are rebounding. Yes, frogs, anurans, are rebounding in some places because of the reintroduction of bison. Beavers are taking over some of their lands through the river systems of Texas. And they're helping to take out some of the, what's the bad one?
Cedar?
They take out cedar, and they also take out some mesquite, which is an undesirable. So they help keep that trimmed, keep that woody encroachment trimmed.
And I would say that it is unfortunate to lose a keystone species. Like, you don't want that. But like with the beaver, they're shifting. And so now you have this new keystone species in a new ecosystem. And so if we can watch these, well, not watch, but like these species will shift their ranges, and maybe you get a keystone species where you didn't have one, or it's filling the role left by one who's already moved on. Like they're not completely interchangeable, of course, but you have to allow some room for overturn of keystone species. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Explain that well.
Yeah.
Okay.
Salmon's another one. So when we put in bridges, we've made salmon locally extinct in the upper parts of some of their tributary rivers in the Pacific Northwest and New England. There's been a big effort to remove those dams, or at least make salmon walks, so they can get back to these places. And the big difference is when they go to the top of these tributaries, they die. That is a huge nutrient flux for the entire ecosystem. In Alaska, the signature of the marine signature, using stable isotopes, we can trace that their impact, because of where bears are eating them and now moving that nutrient cycle, they're dumping it tens, if not hundreds of kilometers away from that river. That nutrient cycling is profound.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, we talk a lot about, we've mentioned several times on the podcast this notion that we live in a world that is so lacking in so many of the most important species that were here not all that long ago. And that a lot of the ecosystems we look at are already broken in that sense. That you are missing major impacts like that. And it's trying to figure out how to restore as much of that stability as you can is a really daunting task.
Yeah.
It is. So we're almost out of time, I know, but I'm going to say one more thing.
No, go ahead.
So that's where the fossil record comes in. So we have pre-anthropogenic effects. This is what it looked like before humans started messing around with the whole system. And I think about it as vectors. So we had this environment with this group of animals, and we've moved to this environment with this group of animals. If we know from projections how the environment is going to change, we can continue our vectors and kind of identify what the biodiversity potential looks like. And so, yeah, we have that impact in the middle, but if we can create a long enough vector using enough fossil sites, we can kind of see where humans play a role and kind of the blip in the system. And we have to keep humans in the model for going forward, because humans aren't going away anytime soon.
And we're the ones who put it back.
So it's kind of like this is the change before humans, this is the change with and going forward with humans.
Yeah. Cool. I like the idea of you're basically like, you're filling out a graph and then able to continue it into empty space to get an estimate of what might be.
Right. Yep.
Cool.
That's the goal.
So we have time for a couple more questions, and a bunch more just flooded in. So I'm going to ask a few more, and let's see if we can get some quick answers so we can get through a bunch of these. Lightning round. The first is from Finn, who asks, who says, I've always been interested in the idea of whether or not we should intervene to preserve endangered species if they're going extinct due to non-human related factors. So my question is, would you say there are ethical limitations to how humans should intervene with failing ecosystems? I know I said lightning round and then I asked you like a super detailed, complex question.
But yeah, there you go. Yeah. Are there ethical issues? Yes.
All right, cool.
So I think we all want to intervene, right? Like, we don't want to see the polar bear go extinct. We want to help.
Or frogs in Colombia.
Frogs in Colombia, yeah. And there are efforts we can make, but there's only so much, right? And so we can make sure there's corridors for climate connectivity to allow for species shifting. We can make sure that, there's wildflower corridors through agriculture, pastures, or agriculture lands. We can facilitate continued survival. But we can't ensure that it happens.
Yeah.
Right.
And so when you get into the ethics of it, I'm going to sound like a real horrible person, but sometimes there may not be an option to connect these habitats. Sometimes it might be the endpoint. The rhinos went extinct in Tennessee at one point. It's part of that ecosystem turnover.
Yeah, I like the idea of making the situation as best as you can to give them a chance.
Yeah. Let's not make it worse.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Rather than necessarily, all right, we need to breed as many of these we can and just start putting them everywhere.
Right. You're making quality of life adjustments.
Yeah.
And there are efforts for that. Like, conservation breeding is a very real thing and has success stories.
Oh, yeah. Many.
And even the white rhino has done fairly well with this. Zoos are able to breed and release them. And so that's part of facilitating, I think. But unfortunately, there might come a day when when the white rhino is no longer viable on the landscape. And so at what point are you doing a disservice?
Right.
And that's when it gets into the real ethical dilemmas.
The two debates I always...
Big debate, yeah.
Yeah.
And along those same lines, we have another question from Boyan, who asks, when/if does an invasive species become a native species?
Oh, God.
So this is a great point to mention that if you'd like to learn more from these two wonderful folks, their Twitter handles are underneath their names.
Yes.
So if you want to ask them more questions later that we run out of time to discuss in detail.
I will say I'm really horrible at Twitter, so you have a much better chance if you have a question tweeting him.
Yeah.
Don't be offended if it's short and snappy.
I will do my best.
I only get 120 characters.
But I'll check it. I'll get on tonight and tomorrow. How's that? That's my deal.
My quick answer would be that going from one connected ecosystem to the next, if they can naturally make that connection, then they're probably native enough at that point. But if they are introduced, which we're going to call unnaturally, even though everything around us is natural, we're living, if it's introduced by humans, that is still unnatural, and it's now invasive forever.
I'd agree with that.
Right.
We are also invasives.
Yes, we were introduced by humans.
Yeah.
Indeed. All right, one last question, and I apologize for anyone out there if we didn't get to your question. Stay in touch, reach out to these cool folks.
There are a lot of good questions.
Josh on Facebook asked, how might one pursue a career in conservation paleontology?
So Jeff and I took different but similar routes. So we'll just quickly go through how we did this. I came at it from a biology perspective. I studied biology in my undergrad. I was in a pre-med program, but knew that's not what I wanted to do. And I was a I think I was in the second semester of my junior year when I learned that paleontology was a thing that people do and study, and like I could do that.
Yep.
I started with an internship the summer after I graduated at Ashfall. If people need internships, Ashfall is a great place to intern. And then I studied geology for a while, and then I came to ETSU and studied the rhinos there. That was my paleo master's degree. But I really struggled with making that work mean something. Like, what does it matter that we had this rhino in Tennessee 5 million years ago? You know, like, it's cool, sure. But what does it really tell us? And so I really struggled with that. And it was this really interesting skeleton because it has these long legs. It's browsing, and most of the rhinos were grazing. And so I started putting together things have changed, and this is a different pattern than these other rhinos, and so that's what led me to doing this kind of paleontology and looking at how it's living in its ecosystem. So that's how I did it. I did a teaching master's at one point. It's
circuitous.
Yes.
I would say that I also have a circuitous route. I started as a bison rancher in Wisconsin. That's how I grew up. But I always wanted to be a geologist. I always liked rocks. So I went and got my degree in geology. And then I got involved with the paleo club that was at my undergrad. And I was like, oh, paleo is pretty cool too. And it still got rocks involved. And people are like, oh, we've got all these bison fossils. You know bison, just start working on these. All right, cool. I know the species. And then I just continued with my paleo master's at ETSU. And because of my farming background, with bison ranching background, I always had an applied feel to whatever I do. I always want to do the basic science and then immediately apply it, how to make it useful. So it was less of a jump for me, I think. And that's what led me to a wildlife sciences, where I could merge what I was bringing to a new table. The discipline didn't really use paleo before, and so my advisor certainly didn't.
Can I jump in real quick?
Sure.
So neither of us are in a paleontology department right now. He's in a wildlife department. I was in an ecosystem science department. You don't typically find a department of paleontology.
Right.
Yeah. So don't go looking for one.
If you do find one.
Yeah. Great.
Oh,
yeah. But you have to learn the skills along the way. Read widely and read deeply, and apply it. And you make it your own. This is so new. There's no prescriptive way to say how to do it. Just do it.
One of the things that I think is super cool, I didn't mention this in the beginning, and I mentioned it at the beginning of every of the other 3 live chats. Rachel and Jeff are yet again friends of ours from grad school, from our master's program. And one of the super cool things that we didn't originally plan it that way. We didn't plan this to just be a class reunion. But it worked out, and I think it's so cool, and I hope for people who have seen all 4 of these to take note of the fact that, you think of that schooling, you think of paleontologists or any scientist as following a path and then becoming a scientist. But what is so cool about getting to talk to our colleagues is that we all came from different places. I'm pretty sure every one of us came from a different state.
Yeah.
All the people you've seen started out in a different state, all converged doing different projects, different research at this one school. And now you see that we've all gone off to we have people who got into ancient DNA, which is completely no one at our school did that. We've got conservation paleo folks who that wasn't a thing that we had going on at our school. Museum work, and it's such a cool display of the diversity, not just of what people do in paleontology, but where they come from and how they get there.
Yeah.
We are several ships passing,
yes,
on our respective journeys, and it's just so much fun to get that perspective.
It is so much fun to go to conferences and see everyone give talks on what they're doing now, and we take the big group picture, but we're all presenting in different sessions. And
yeah,
it's
really
great. Neat.
And it's been real helpful for the podcast.
Oh yeah,
because
it's
it means
great.
like when we were doing the ancient DNA episode, it was like, cool, I don't know anything about DNA, and I texted Leah. I was like, hey, do you mind if I call you and just ask you a bunch of questions?
And we're going to record it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then we're going to record.
You should have split us up. You didn't get your money's worth here.
Right? That's true. We'll have you back. We'll bring it. We haven't done a rhinos episode. So
All right.
Maybe.
Or and we haven't bovids and stuff like that.
That's
still.
true.
Yeah.
So we might pick your brains at some point.
All right.
Rachel and Jeff, thank you so much for being here. This was tons of fun.
Yeah. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Everyone on the internet, thank you for joining us. Thank you for following us.
For awesome questions.
Thank you for awesome questions.
Questions.
Like we said in the beginning, this is the last live chat we have planned at the moment, which is not to say we're never going to do it again. If you liked it, if you've enjoyed it, let us know. If you want to see more, we have a lot more cool friends who will talk about all sorts of cool stuff. If you haven't seen them, they are all archived on YouTube. You can watch them on our YouTube channel. We will also be releasing the audios on the podcast stream, so you can listen to the audio. So if you didn't get enough the first time, you can walk around, go for a walk in the woods and listen again. Go check out our Zazzle store for these cool new shirts that we have. Follow our friends on the Twitters and the social medias if you want to get more from them. I see we're getting requests now. I mentioned rhinos, and
there we go.
Yes. That's what we like to see.
Yep.
We have a few friends who will be very excited about it.
All right.
You now have our young viewer Felix is rooting for
There we go.
rhinos. Thank you once again for joining us. Will, this has been super fun.
It has. It's
if
been really
people
cool.
want to do it, we'll do it again. Best of luck with your cool down from your dissertation, congratulations on your doctor statuses.
Thank you.
Good luck moving forward.
Thanks.
Cool.
Yeah. This has
Great
been
to talk to you.
Yeah.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.